All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Outreach and Programs Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders works with over 135 schools in Pittsburgh, West Virginia, Ohio, and Florida. We offer study travel seminars for educators to Europe and Israel, and throughout this pandemic have continued to offer in-school and community programs on topics relating to Jewish history, Israel, the Holocaust, genocide, and hate. We are very excited to celebrate 10 years of engaging programming that supports educators and students, nurturing inclusivity and social justice. CWB has a vision for this new year and our post-pandemic world that will bring programming that reaches more learners and will be a beacon of hope for the future. Welcome to today's event, the second in our 10-part series on the conflict in the Middle East with Avi Ben-Hur. Today's session will focus in on the British Mandate period, 1922 to 1948. I am delighted to introduce our scholar in residence, Avi Ben-Hur. As our scholar in residence, Avi has lectured, taught, and facilitated workshops in the United States, Warsaw, Prague, Berlin, and Greece. Please send any questions you might have via the chat feature directly to Avi. He will answer as many as possible after his update. And with that, I'll turn the program over to you, Avi.
Thank you, Ellen. Welcome, everybody. It has been a month since we last met. Those of you who were with me in the opening session in this series, this 10-part series. And I realize it may be going a little bit slowly for some of you because you haven't had enough blood and guts yet because we really haven't started the war. But I think it was important to kind of give the background to understand why we have two national movements here that are clashing. So I actually took a peek at what we did a month ago just to make sure that I'm starting where we left off, but I will remind you a few things. And most important, I think, to remind you is that during World War I, the British made all kinds of promises to different sides. But in terms of the Zionist movement, we have the famous Balfour Declaration of November of 1917. And we went over this declaration together, understanding that the legalese, all the diplomatic lingo was set out in such a way that you can read it in so many different ways and understand what you want to understand from this declaration. What is important to understand is that this declaration, which started off as a letter, actually becomes immediately official British policy and is going to be integrated in the peace talks, that take place in Paris in 1919 when the war is over, which means, ladies and gentlemen, as we have the League of Nations being established, the precursor to the UN, the League of Nations will get involved in this whole thing and will accept the premise of the Balfour Declaration. In other words, what I'm trying to share with you here is that between this declaration in 1917 and let's say 1920, we have a situation whereby the so-called international community accepts the premise that Jews deserve a national home in Palestine. Okay, everybody kind of knows what we're talking about back then, but it wasn't said very explicitly in terms of the state. But the idea that Jews deserve self-determination was something that was accepted by the international community, and this is important. This is very important for the Jews, but it's also going to have ramifications for, let's say, the Jews' rivals in the country itself. So I think we have to stop for a moment and raise a basic question, because we're talking here in this session about the British Mandate period, which, look, Ellen said 1922 to 1948, which is correct. Some of you may know it as 1917 to 1947. The reality is that the British actually succeed in completely conquering what will turn out to be Palestine by October 1918. There will be military rule for the next few years. In 1920, the League of Nations, or what's turning into the League of Nations, is going to, in Italy, in San Remo, is going to accept the concept that the British will have a mandate to prepare the natives for future self-determination in the whole region, including Palestine. And by 1922, the mandate actually begins. Okay, and it begins with actually delineating what we're talking about. I'm going to get to some maps in a few moments. This is important. But before all this, we have to try to understand together what's in it for the British. I mean, what is the importance of Palestine, okay, or the area that becomes later on State of Israel and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, okay, territories. What is the importance of this small, pretty geographically peripheral area to the British? Okay, so first of all, we have to keep in mind, okay, this is right after World War I, that India is the cherry on the icing on the British Empire cake. I know that sounded right, but you understand what I'm saying to you. Basically, India is the most important protectorate colony part of the empire the British have. And by controlling Palestine, and of course, Egypt was controlled from 1882 by the British, and now also controlling what later on will be Jordan and later on Iraq, you actually have an overland route to India and not just a sea route. So you have both the control of the overland and you have control of the sea route because you now have Sinai plus the Suez Canal plus Egypt. So this is kind of important. Now, the Suez Canal, which is this major artery, actually, commercial artery for the British, and strategic artery, and not just India, but for the Far East in general, is very important to them. So they need to protect it. And by controlling Palestine, it's kind of a geographic buffer, a strategic buffer that protects their assets in Egypt. All this is true in 1920, 21, 22. Here's something tricky, folks. It's a rhetorical question. When is oil discovered in the Middle East? And the reason I'm raising this question is that what's very, very clear to everybody, certainly by the end of World War I, is the importance of oil. Let's think about this for a second. World War I, you had the introduction, of course, of tanks. You have air warfare. And as you're using all kinds of trucks, you're using all kinds of machinery that needs oil, needs gas. So oil is very important, starting from the beginning of the 20th century. Certainly, following World War I, all the countries understand this is a race between the world powers to get their hands as much oil as they possibly can. By the way, in brackets, this is an era of huge oil exploration in the United States. You know, the United States has huge oil reserves, but what about the Middle East? So I'm glad you asked that question. Around 1927, 28, massive reserves of oil were discovered in Iraq, which is under British control. But that's like 10 years after the Balfour Declaration, okay? And that's like 7 years after the mandate system is put in place. So you can't put the cart, you know, you can't kind of like reverse where the cart and the horse are here. The importance of oil, finding strategic quantities of oil in the Middle East, in areas under direct British control or tangential British control, is another good reason for the British to want to hold on to those. It's not the case in 1919, but it will be the case in 1929. Ergo, what's going to happen is in the early 1930s, the British are going to build a deep water international port in the city of Haifa. Before the British do that, historically, Haifa did not have a significant port. You have a bay there. The British actually built a significant deep water harbor. Okay, opens its doors for business in 1933. They worked very, very quickly, very efficiently, and they laid down 4 pipelines to transfer crude oil from Iraq to Haifa. They're called H1, H2, H3, H4, Haifa 1, Haifa 2, Haifa, and so on and so forth. I mean, these lines still exist, but they don't do anything because we're with Iraq since 48. But the bottom line is that the British actually also built oil refineries, and this is saying it's in brackets now. It raised Haifa economically dramatically because you have petrochemicals, a lot of stuff, a lot of tangential stuff, things that are that not tangential, but rather things that are part and parcel of the oil industry that began to be created in the Haifa area. Okay, so again, let's say by the closing of the 1920s, there's another strategic importance, which is to hold on to Haifa, to create Haifa as an international port, to bring crude to the UK, which they succeeded in doing. Okay, so these are all the reasons, let's say, for the British to want to hold on to the area. I'm saying that because, you know, the British are going to be ruling for about 30 years. And the bottom line is that the reality is that they didn't really get a lot of, as we'd say in French, a lot of nachis, a lot of pleasure out of ruling the country. At the end of the day, it's going to be interesting. We asked the question, what are their interests in 1947? They're not entirely the same. Okay, when the British decide to pull out or to hand this problem over to the UN, at that point, they already have divested themselves of India. Okay, so it'll raise some interesting questions about what's the importance of the area to the British in 1947, but here we just cover what the importance is, okay, just after World War I. Now we have to talk about maps and boundaries and lines, because one of the things that should be, but is often not obvious to people when you talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, is that Israel, albeit is a sovereign state, does not have international borders, or I should say has some, but not all international borders. What does that mean? A border is a line which the countries abutting and adjacent to that line agree that's an international border between them. No, they didn't say two countries because you have borders that have three countries on them. That's possible, yeah? But a border is only international border if the countries that are sitting on it agree that this is an international border between those countries. And if you look at Israel circa 2021, right now, well, we have an internationally accepted border between Israel and Egypt, which is part and parcel of the peace treaty signed between Israel and Egypt, which we're going to talk about later on in this course. We have a partial border that's accepted by Jordan and Israel. That's it. The border between Israel and Lebanon may be accepted by the international community. It's not accepted by Lebanon. And therefore, it's not an international border because both sides don't accept it. The line between Israel and Syria is an armistice line. It's not an internationally accepted border. Okay, certainly the Syrians don't accept it and much of the world doesn't accept it. So we take a look at this, kind of interesting. Israel doesn't really have international borders that are recognized. Having said all this, the map you have in front of you is showing you three different discussions or three different situations historically. What's colored in red is actually what would have been under a British protectorate or British control if the Sykes-Picot agreement that we referenced during our last session would have actually come through, and that's 1916. The dotted blue line, which you mostly see off to the right in the east, is actually the proposal of the Zionist delegation to the peace conference in Paris in 1919, which was not accepted ultimately by the League of Nations or by the players there. But please note what the Zionists were looking at was what would be all of Israel today, plus the territories, plus a nice piece of Lebanon, okay, a small piece of Syria, and a significant piece of what today is Jordan. This didn't fly. Ultimately, the solid blue line that you see will represent British Mandate Palestine starting from 1923. Okay, so having said that, our next map is showing you what is on the table, okay, in San Remo in 1920, when the League of Nations accepts the concept of a British mandate based on, partially based on the Balfour Declaration. And please note, the British mandate, as the League of Nations sought initially, included what today is Israel, the territories. When I say territories, I mean Gaza and the West Bank, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan was part of the British Mandate Palestine from 1920 to 1922. What I'm getting at is in 22, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, also known as Transjordan, was removed from the table, was removed from this map, and was no longer considered Palestine for reasons that we're going to get into in a little bit. But the bottom line is the map is constantly changing. And one of the interesting aspects of all this, and this is what it looks like starting from 1922, okay, please note where my cursor is. You'll notice that this has kind of finger sticking up. In Hebrew, we call it literally the finger of the Galilee. In English, you'd call it the Galilee panhandle. Probably a lot of you have been to the northernmost town in Israel, which is where my cursor is, which is called Metula, which is kind of surrounded by Lebanon, as you can see over here with my cursor. The reason you have this awkward configuration is that the British wanted to ensure that 2 out of the 3 headwaters of the Jordan River, which is basically the source of the Sea of Galilee, okay, would be in the British mandate and not the French mandate. And that was negotiation. And so the border was moved further to the north, and the French received some concessions in Europe, okay, because they were talking about all different kinds of things that were taking place between the British and the French. the bottom line is that that's why you have the Galilee Panhandle inside the state of Israel. The truth is you had a series of Zionist communities up there, but that's not the primary reason that the British would be doing it. The British want the headwaters. The Zionists are able to say, hey, we have these communities up here, and the British say, oh, well, we have to protect these communities. But the truth is the British were interested in the headwaters, and this is good for Israel till today. So this is also something to think about. So now let's talk about something that is extremely important, which you really haven't talked about up to now. What are the causes of conflict between the two national movements, between the Zionist movement, the Jewish national movement, and an Arab national movement? Actually, in our last session, I told you that there is no local Palestinian Arab national movement, okay, as a force, as something that is very, very well articulated until 1920. Why is 1920 this magic number or magic year? For one simple reason. The big dream of most Arab nationalists up until 1920 was what they would call a Greater Syria. And a Greater Syria would include what today is Syria and Lebanon and Israel and Jordan and the territories, and maybe a piece of Iraq as well. This was the concept of Greater Syria. In other words, Palestine was not considered in of itself some kind of integral political entity or territorial entity as far as the Arabs were concerned up until 1920. What ultimately happens is the British who promised Faisal, okay, that he's one of the two sons of we talked about this, about Hussein, okay, of Mecca, the Sharif of Mecca. He's one of the two sons. We have Abdallah and we have Faisal. Faisal is promised by the British that he can go to take the throne in Damascus. The problem is they've also promised the French that they can have their mandate there. The French received their mandate, so Faisal goes to Damascus, okay, and the Arabs get very excited about all this, and ultimately a war breaks out because the British are present, sorry, the French are present, and the French are going to rather quickly give Faisal and his supporters the heave-ho. And this is going to be crushing for the Arab national movement, but this is going to awaken a localized nationalism among the Palestinian Arabs, which didn't so much exist before that because they were part of a bigger picture. Faisal's compensation is going to be, he's going to receive Iraq from the British, and he'll be taken care of by the Arabs themselves in the 1950s, but in any event, he receives Iraq, and Abdallah, who's his brother, is already sitting in Transjordan, in what today is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. He ain't going nowhere. And he makes it very, very clear to Churchill. And so we'll talk in a second why Churchill does what he does. But the bottom line is we have the rise of a Palestinian Arab nationalism, first and foremost due to the collapse of the big dream of the Greater Syria. That's number one. Number two, the Balfour Declaration doesn't really talk about national rights of other groups in Palestine aside from the Jews. And the moment that the League of Nations recognizes it, and it's very, very clear that the British are planning to implement this as policy, this is going to engender aggravation and tension among the Arab majority population in the country. You're going to have some pretty large Zionist land purchases that had been already in the workings before World War I broke out and are actually, right after the war, are going to come through. Just to give you a sense, we're talking about the Jezreel Valley, which is the whole series of valleys that run from Haifa Bay in the west and all the way down to almost to the Jordan River in the east, under Beit Sha'an. The whole valley system there from the Jezreel Valley is going to be, most of that's going to be purchased. And that's why already, ladies and gentlemen, in 1921, you'll have the first kibbutz and the first moshav, and each one is on a different end, I mean geographically, of this big valley system. So there's a sense that the Zionists are purchasing out of land. There is renewed immigration. We have the third aliyah, the third wave of Jewish immigration takes place right after the war from 1919 to 1923, and it's followed immediately by another wave of operation in 1924. Okay, we're seeing a lot of dynamic Zionist activity. Tel Aviv is rebuilt because it was basically the Jews were expelled from Tel Aviv by the Ottoman Turks during the war. They return, they rebuild the city. The city starts to grow rapidly. We're seeing more towns, villages, and cities being constructed by the Zionists. And the Arabs are seeing that. Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, and this is a little bit of a latecomer to the game, but is already going to be an attempt from the beginning to insert it in the Arab side, but it'll be completely inserted, well inserted by 1929, 28, 29, and that is a religious layer to the conflict, okay, between Jews and Muslims. And here I have to repeat what I said in the previous session. It's very important to understand this. Not every national conflict that we know around the world centers around religion. Not every national conflict has a religious layer to it. It's not a necessary layer. Okay, it's not a necessary layer. And I would make the argument it didn't have to become an important part in this conflict, because on the Jewish side, the Zionist movement was very secular. They were very secular. And on the Arab side, it was a mixed bag. And the truth is that the initiative to insert a religious element into the conflict will come from the Arabs, will be picked up by the Jews rather quickly. And as we roll through this course, you're going to see it becomes more and more central. It's not central yet, but it's going to be inserted into the whole story. And the real beginning of conflict starts already in 1920. We have a series of Arab rioting and protests in 1920 and 1921. I want to just stop for a moment on the photograph you see on the left-hand side. This is from 1920. This is called the Nebi Musa riots. The term Nebi Musa probably means nothing to most of you. Nebi is prophet in Arabic, like Navi in Hebrew. Musa is the Arabic version of Moses. So this is the prophet Moses. And if you drive from Jerusalem down to Jericho, a lot of you are familiar with this road, before you get down to the Jericho plain, on the right-hand side, there is an Islamic site called Nebi Musa. It's a very interesting, made-up, bogus site, deliberately made-up site. It was made in the 13th century. This site was made up as the purported burial of Moses. Moses from Hebrew Bible fame. Now, you should know that Moses, or Musa, is also an important prophet for Islam. But does this mean that Islam doesn't accept the biblical narrative that he never made it to the land of Israel and was buried somewhere? We don't know where he was buried, but he was buried somewhere, let's say, in what Jordan is today. Okay. And the answer is no, they knew that. But in the 13th century, when you have a struggle between Christians and Muslims over the Holy Land, and you have a huge Christian pilgrimage during Easter, they created this bogus site. It's a very beautiful site, actually. It's supposed to be Nebi Musa, the prophet Moses' burial. It's actually a Sufi, kind of like a Sufi monastery, dervishes today. But the bottom line is that they actually have a pilgrimage and festival. It's called Nebi Musa Festival each year around Easter time. And that was in order to create a counterweight, an Islamic counterweight to Christian pilgrimage. Thus far, there's nothing to do with the Jews, as you've ascertained all on your own. What you may not realize is that the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar that doesn't have leap years. And what this means, folks, is that, their holidays are not the same time of year. It's not like Christmas or Hanukkah that are always, around December. Well, Christmas always is, but Hanukkah shifts a little bit. The Muslim calendar shifts a lot more than the Jewish one does because of its lunar aspect and because there's no leap year to correct things. What this means is they actually built a bogus site and they created a festival on a date that corresponds to the Christian calendar, not the Muslim one. And it's a Muslim festival. Okay, why did I talk about this? Because in 1920, and typically what they do is they march down, have a big procession, on horseback and by foot, from Jerusalem, from the old city of Jerusalem, down to the desert to Nebi Musa. They had all kinds of speeches and proclamations at that point in 1920, and they began rioting and attacking and killing Jews in the old city. Okay, that's what they're called, the Nebi Musa riots of 1920. And the following in 1921, we had rioting again. Together in both of these years, all told, we had about 56 Jews being killed by Arabs and about 357 wounded. One has to keep in mind here, one has to take into consideration that the British are present, they're shocked, they do not react fast enough, and the Jews react fast. They create a defense group organization to try to defend Jews in Tel Aviv who are being attacked from Jaffa and Jews in Jerusalem. And this group or organization is known as the Haganah. But we'll get there in a moment. I'm now fast forwarding a decade because we had almost a decade of quiet between Jews and Arabs in the 1920s after the rioting in 1921. And then what we have is in 1928, we begin to have a conflict revolving around the Western Wall. Please take a look at the two photos in front of you. I assume, I should never assume anything, that most of you have probably visited Israel, and if you visit Israel, you visited Jerusalem, and if you visited Jerusalem, you visited the Western Wall and the Western Wall Prayer Plaza. The Western Wall Prayer Plaza you see today in Jerusalem was created in the wake of the Six-Day War. Okay, they started working on that plaza several days after the Six-Day War in June of 1967. What did the area look like before the Six-Day War? That's what you're looking at right now. You basically had a very narrow alleyway that was something like, I don't know, 5 yards deep and maybe 15 yards wide, okay, length. Okay, so we're talking about something very small. It was an alleyway because you had a medieval Muslim neighborhood built almost up to the wall. And this is what you're seeing here. You're also seeing something else. You're seeing men and women praying next to each other without any kind of partition, which they know they shouldn't be doing because none of the people you're seeing here are Reform or Conservative or Reconstructionist Jews. They're all, okay, or progressive Orthodox Jews, whatever. These movements, Jewish dreams, don't exist in their consciousness, the people you're looking at right now in these photos, okay? They know there should be, quote unquote, a partition, but there isn't. And in 1928, for Yom Kippur, in September of 28, they put up a small wooden partition to separate, for the first time, men and women. And this was an abrogation of the status quo. British police forcibly removed the mechitza, the partitions, but this began a huge tumult between Arabs and Jews, and essentially will have a religious Arab leader who is losing popularity is going to latch onto this and bring in the entire Arab and Muslim world, making the claim, please listen carefully because we'll hear this claim again, and you hear it today as well, that the Jews are trying to take over the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, that is, say, the entire Temple Mount, by putting a piece of wood between men and women, okay, to separate them in their prayers at the Western Wall, okay? The Jews are trying to undermine and take over the entire Temple Mount, and this, in fact, is also a holy site to Islam. They're claiming in 1928-29, the wall itself. This is where Muhammad had basically tied his magical, mystical flying beast, a Burak. Be that as it may, ladies and gentlemen, what's going to happen is between this incident in Yom Kippur 28 and 1929, there are going to be a lot of provocations where the Muslims are going to be running beasts through the prayers in this narrow alleyway. They're going to make the lives of people are very difficult. They're going to make a lot of noise deliberately during prayers. There'll be tit for tat. You're going to have organized Jewish groups going down there and also waving flags and so on and so forth. In any event, here's the punchline, and it's an important one. In 1928 and 29, we have the deliberate introduction of a religious element to the conflict. It was introduced by the Arab side, and it's with us till today. This does not mean that the war in 48 revolves around this, but it does mean that certainly after 67, the religious element is an important element that is becoming even more important as time is moving along. So 1929, you're going to have rioting breaking out again. And here, and this is infamous or famous, if you will, there are attacks all over the country, but the biggest attack is going to take place in Hebron. The Jewish community in Hebron was not large. They'd been there for hundreds of years. They had good relations with their Arab neighbors. Evidently, most of the murderers who committed massacre there were not the local people. The Jews who survived the massacre there were hidden by their neighbors. In other words, the people who were not killed were hidden by their neighbors. But this was very shocking. And because you'd had relative quiet for almost 10 years, the British had reduced their military presence and police presence dramatically. And therefore, they were in no shape to actually stop this or prevent this. And from a Jewish perspective, this becomes ground zero. Why does this become ground zero? Because if there were some kind of fantasies on the Jewish side that we can come to some kind of modus vivendi with the Arabs, the sense in the wake of this was that from the Jewish perspective at that moment in 1929, after the massacre in Hebron, was that, and this is what I'm giving you, it's not a direct quote I'm giving you now, but this is more or less the spirit of what was felt at the time. I'm paraphrasing actually. We are living in a sea of Arab hatred. There was a sense that here we have to get our act together and that we have to protect ourselves because the British are not going to do the job for us. Okay, here I want to stop because I haven't talked yet about Jewish self-defense. We're going to get there in a few moments. It's important. I want to look at the leadership on both sides at this moment. And at this moment means 1929, 1930, 1931. I want to look at the Arab side first because I think many of us are unfamiliar with the Arab side and what's going on. You're seeing three figures here. The truth is that most of you are probably well familiar with the right-handmost photograph, or not, maybe not the visual image, but the name Haji Amir al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was a troublemaker from day one, from 1920. He was egging people on already in Nabi Musa, a big troublemaker from day one. What we call today a radical Islamist. He's a religious leader. He comes from a family of notables, a very, very wealthy, important Jerusalem family called the al-Husseini family. His uncle, who's the guy in the middle, Musa Kazim al-Husseini, was the mayor of Jerusalem in 1918 and 1920. The British gave him the boot because he mouthed off against the British, but he is the head of something called the Arab Executive Committee, which was a relatively popular political organization that was losing its popularity because they weren't managing to gain much traction vis-a-vis the Zionists and vis-a-vis the British. And the person to the left came from another notable family in Jerusalem, the Nashashibi family. He personally was a moderate. He became the mayor of Jerusalem, I think, from 1920 to 1934 for 14 years. By the way, when he died in 1951, he was like a minister in the Jordanian government, and his second wife was a French Jew. Interestingly enough, he was much more of a moderate, and he was somebody that the Zionists actually could talk to, and actually had a kind of open channel with him. He was the head of the opposition. Haji Amir al-Husseini was the head of the Supreme Muslim Council, a position he got by the British. The British made a big mistake. Okay, he was a troublemaker in 1920. In 1922, he gets a pardon, and the British try the bear hug with him. They give him a very prominent position, which has him sitting on a lot of money because he's going to be in charge of all the Muslim trusts, religious trusts. And this is a problem because he can give patronage out, and he begins to rise. He is much more of a hardliner than his uncle, Musa Kazim, the middle guy. And we're going to meet him again, of course, and I'm sure a lot of you folks are familiar with Haji Amir al-Husseini. He's a real troublemaker. But you look at these three folks, essentially, Haji Amir al-Husseini, who had lost a lot of altitude by 1928, sees what's going on the rest of the world as this opportunity to get back in the game, and it totally works. He gets the entire Muslim world on board. And this, by the way, is very interesting because his ploy to turn to the Arab and Muslim world actually sets the Palestinian national movement on a course whereby they're asking for help from the Arab Muslim world, which is much stronger than them. They themselves are fragmented. The folks you see here, the two on the right hate the one on the left. They hate each other very, very much. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, what that means, how it plays out in the field, as we say. And by reaching out to the pan-Arab world, they basically put their fate in their hands. And this is going to be one of the reasons why the Palestinian national movement remains weak, remains divided, and remains actually under the control, certainly from 1948 onwards, of the Arab international community. And they've been trying to claw themselves back up by themselves. This was actually quite a big error it's kind of interesting because the exact opposite thing happened with the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement basically pushed out the diaspora Jews from being the decision makers, and actually just wanted support, but didn't allow the diaspora to weigh in too much on policy. And the exact opposite happens over here. So who do we have on the Zionist, the Jewish side? And again, the snapshot here is 1929 to 1931. Chaim Weizmann is the head of the World Zionist Organization, and he is the person that the British want to talk to, respect. He's an Anglophile. He spends most of his time in London, not in Palestine. He's a moderate. He's a centrist and a moderate, and the British want to talk to him. But he's getting on in years, and he is willing to make a lot of concessions. David Ben-Gurion, and this photo doesn't really do him justice because you're seeing him here in 1951, and we're talking 20 years previous to this, when he's much younger, of course. He starts to become in direct competition with Chaim Weizmann already in 1929, okay, when you have the establishment of the Jewish Agency. And by 1931, Weizmann is really starting to lose altitude within the Zionist movement, and Ben-Gurion is starting to take over. By 35, Ben-Gurion is the top dog, and Chaim Weizmann is completely sidelined, even though he's still struggling with Ben-Gurion. The truth is Ben-Gurion is a stronger leader. He's much more hardline. He's a socialist Zionist, he's left-wing, but he's very, very hardline as well. So these are two very different personalities, and the British are not so keen on David Ben-Gurion, but they have no choice. Once the Zionist movement chooses him over Weizmann, they have to deal with him as well. So let's get back to 1920. We have this rioting, and what you see here are two of the main founders of the Haganah in 1920. The gentleman off to the right is somebody probably many of you have heard of before, may know him quite well, and that is Zev Jabotinsky. Zev Jabotinsky, very, very important Zionist leader from Odessa. Let's say he's like the next generation after Herzl. What we would define as center-right today. He created something called the revisionist movement. He was very much what we call a maximalist, meaning he was demanding, he said, listen, let's not footsie around. Let's not say Jewish national home. Let's call it what it is. We want a Jewish state, and we want it on both sides of the Jordan River. He was a maximalist. He was very much for building military capacity, security capacity. And during World War I, he was constantly pressuring the British to establish some kind of Jewish armed force, which the British were reluctant to do. Ultimately, they will do it at the very end of the war, and Jabotinsky will become an officer there, and he'll participate at the very, 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 very end of the war, the last 5 minutes. Okay, and some of the people who rode with him and were fighting with him are the people he's going to bring to defense in Jerusalem. Haganah means defense. Pinchas Rutenberg, a very interesting, very different from Jabotinsky, also Russian, but very left wing. He was a communist. I mean, he was like part of the whole. He participated in both the Russian Revolution of 1905 and then in 1917. He was in and out with the big shots there, and ended up having to flee in 1918. He was also an engineer, and his expertise is hydroelectrics, and he basically convinces the British to build a significant power station, which he's going to be standing behind. He's going to be the one who's going to build it up in Jaffa, Tel Aviv initially, and then a water-powered electrical plant, a place called Naharayim, which is the meeting of two rivers, the Yarmouk River and the Jordan River in the north of the country, which actually worked quite well. It supplied energy for most of the country, with the exception of Jerusalem. And he's considered a very serious guy. He, together with Jabotinsky, he'll be actually commanding groups of this very hastily formed Haganah in Tel Aviv to protect the people there, and Jabotinsky in Jerusalem. Jabotinsky is going to be jailed by the British for holding arms. Haji Amin Husseini was kind of, I think, jailed in absentia because he fled, and the two of them were pardoned by Herbert Samuel, who was the first High Commissioner, who was Jewish. Jabotinsky is an interesting figure. He doesn't remain connected to the Haganah. The bottom line is the Haganah, this first Jewish defense organization during the British Mandate, okay, will over time, over the next 2 decades, become the most significant, most important of the various defense organizations that the Jews will create. Okay, it becomes the most significant, the largest one, and will form very much the backbone of the Israeli army that will emerge in 1948. But in 1920, and certainly until 1929, it's quite small. Not a lot of money is allocated to it. I mean, it's run by the Zionist movement, but they're more interested in you need to buy land and to build up communities, bring immigrants in. So that's what most of the money is going into, not into defense, which means that in 1929, when you have the big attacks and massacre in Hebron and the British are undermanned, Haganah is also not in great shape, and it has to reform itself after 1929, and that's important. I'm saying this to you because their main position, Haganah, means defense. They're going to be defending the Jewish community in British Mandate Palestine, together with the British, in tandem with the British. They're a defense. They're not an offensive, but rather a defensive organization. And just that word is going to engender some people within the organization to break away in 1931, okay, and form what they called Haganah Bet, or like Beta, if you want, that want to be much more offensive towards the Arabs in terms of not just be defensive, but the reality is that most of those people rejoined Haganah in 1937. Those who did not are going to form an alternative organization, which is going to be the Irgun, which we're going to talk about a little bit. So this is already, you said 1920, we have the Haganah, and we mentioned the massacres of 1929. Things are going to quiet down for a few years. However, ladies and gentlemen, and this is very important, with the rise of Hitler in 1933, followed by the disintegration of the status of Polish Jews in Poland in 1935, with the death of Piłsudski, who was a nationalist right-wing politician in Poland, but he protected the Jews. He was not an anti-Semite, personally was not an anti-Semite, and he protected the Jews. When he dies in 1935, his party is still ruling Poland, and they're become quite anti-Semitic. So the clock starts ticking for Polish Jewry already. I'm not talking about the Holocaust now. And what I'm trying to say to you is that between 1933 and 1936, you're going to have the largest wave of Jewish immigration to Mandate Palestine for a whole slew of reasons, which I'll get to in a few moments. Okay, and it is going to completely change the demographics in the country, and it's going to cause an outbreak of the most extreme violence that the Arabs have done to date. 1 minute before the Arabs break out in a general revolt, and actually most of their attacks were pointed at the British, not at the Jews. In 1935, because the big Arab revolt takes place between 36 and 39, in 1935, this guy who's in front of you, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, who is a Muslim cleric. He's a precursor of Hamas. This is like a Hamas guy. And by the way, he's their big hero of Hamas. He is going to form bands of terrorists, and they're going to start to murder British and also Jews. The British are going to hunt him down and kill him in 1935. So his attack's going to take, it takes them several months to track him down and to kill him in a shootout. By the way, FYI, ever heard of Qassam rockets? Qassam rockets, that's what Hamas, they named it after this guy, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam. And you have the Qassam brigades, they named after this guy. He's their big hero of Hamas. He's a precursor. Again, a religious figure, okay, who's talking about using the gun and the Quran on one hand and the gun on the other, okay. So this is a prelude to what's going to take place the following year in 1936, okay, and that is the Great Arab Revolt. It takes place for 3 years between 36 and 39. This, ladies and gentlemen, is their Waterloo. This was a huge error on the Arab part. It was not exactly spontaneous, because it starts off with a general strike in 1936 in the Arab majority in the country. And they thought by doing a general strike, they were going to break the economy. And the opposite was the case. The Jews stepped in and took over parts of the economy that the Arabs now went on strike. So, for example, one of the main harbors was in Jaffa. Went on strike. The Jews asked the British if they could build a jetty north of that in Tel Aviv, which they did, and they began to export their citrus products from the jetty they built in what today is called the Tel Aviv port. The kibbutzim moshavim were able to produce enough food. In other words, this only harmed the Arabs themselves. It caused incredible devastation economically within Arab society and British Mandate Palestine. Okay, and beyond that, it caused a lot of people to get killed on the Arab side. And here we have something very interesting take place before we talk about that on the Jewish side. The Haganah, basically it was very much Ben-Gurion's policy, but Haganah basically said, we need to act with restraint, havlaga, restraint. We are going to offer the British our help, okay, and to help put down this revolt. And what you have here is you have a whole slew of Haganah members who are going to join the British police. They're going to get military training. They're going to join the British police. And there's a lot of them. The British want to be equalized. They had Arabs and Jews joining, okay? But the Jews doing this were doing this deliberately in order to gain military knowledge. During these 3 years, you're going to have an eccentric, brilliant, evidently unbalanced, unstable, that is to say, mentally unstable, emotionally, British officer called Ord Wingate, who is a Zionist. I mean, he thinks the Jews deserve their state. He learns Hebrew, okay, and he requests the capacity to build a Jewish commando force that is going to start to track down all the attackers that people are, all these terrorists who are attacking British forces and Jewish communities in this big Arab revolt. And so he establishes, with the acquiescence of the British, something known as the Special Night Squads, and he begins to train people from the Haganah. And you actually know some of these people. If you look at the photo off to the right, you see Moshe Dayan there before he lost his eye, okay, on the left-hand side. On the right-hand photo, left-hand side, okay, you see all the way to the right, okay, is Yigal Allon. Yigal Allon, who was the top, he was the best Israeli commander in the war in 48. He basically beat the Egyptians in the Negev in 48. He was truly a great general. Never made it to be prime minister. He was good buddies and a protege to a certain extent of Rabin. Okay, and just as an aside, the book Exodus with Ari Ben Canaan. Okay, the main he was Leon Uris actually combined Yigal Allon, who you see off to the right, together with Yitzhak Rabin to create that kind of figure, that literary figure. Okay, and in the middle, the guys in the middle you'll see on the left-hand side, Yitzhak Sadeh. Yitzhak Sadeh is going to be the one who creates the Palmach, which is going to be the shock troops of the Haganah. And these are going to be officers of his. All these three guys are going to learn from Wingate. They're going to learn from him. Okay, as I said, he's a counterinsurgency expert. The problem from the British perspective is he's very successful, by the way, in putting down the Arab revolt. The problem from the British perspective is he goes native, meaning he is so pro-Zionist that he actually goes to the talks that are taking place in London, okay, and actually takes the Zionist side and starts promoting. And they kicked him out of it. The British kicked him out. Ultimately, he was actually, again, a counterinsurgency commander, a general during World War II, and he got killed. Tragically, his plane got shot down in 1944. He led a major revolt in India. In any event, he's buried in Arlington because there were like 5 Americans on that plane. So ultimately, they reinterred all the bodies, the remains to Arlington. So he's actually a British officer who's buried in Arlington. But in any event, he's considered a huge hero. I'm talking again about this guy off to the left here, Wingate. Here he is actually in the jungles. He's already not in Palestine anymore, but he creates this special night squad, which are very significant because this will be the core or the kernel, if you will, no pun intended, of the shock troops, the Palmach, and many of the people who were commanders under him ended up being chiefs of staff of the Israel Defense Forces or major generals in the Israel Defense Forces. So going back to different organizations being created, this guy off the left, Avram Tahomi, in 1931, creates this Haganah Bet because he feels the Haganah is being too complacent. They have to be more proactive. And in 1937, he rejoins, but those people who don't rejoin with him create a different organization, which is called, in an acronym in Hebrew, Etzel, which is Irgun Tzvei Leumi, which means National Military Organization. And the first commander, an excellent commander, was the guy in the middle here. It's called David Raziel, who unfortunately was killed in 1941 on mission with the British. It's kind of interesting because when they're going to form, initially they're going to take action against the British as well. And when World War II breaks out, the Irgun or the Etzel, two names for the same thing, decide to lay their arms down and stop fighting against the British, and they are going to join the British Army. And Raziel, who was really excellent what he did, was accompanied by British officers. They all got bombed by the Nazis on a mission. What's very interesting, folks, is that this organization was under the rubric of the revisionists, which I told you was created by Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was not anti-British. Jabotinsky, who was basically exiled in the 1920s by the British, he wasn't allowed to come back. He thought that the British were the way to go. He admired the British. He thought they were the way to go, and he was not happy about this military organization attacking the British. Okay, but he himself dies in New York in 1940 of a heart attack, and he wasn't able to pressure his own people but they laid their arms down when World War II broke out. Okay, and of course what you see off to the right is Menachem Begin is going to take over the reins, okay, of the organization already in the middle of the war. I think already in 1943 he'll become manages to make the Palestine, and he will become the titular head of this organization, which was much smaller than the Haganah. Okay, and much of its activities took place against the British, in contrast to the Haganah. Okay, we have to talk about the Great Revolt, even though I'm way over the time that I planned, but it's important. Because I said to you that this revolt was the Waterloo, okay, for the Arabs. Why? Number one, we don't have clear records, but what is clear is that thousands of Arabs were killed by the British, thousands of them. Okay, and we're talking about not a large community here. In addition to that, the British are either going to hang, exile, or jail virtually the entire Arab leadership, all the ringleaders. They basically crippled the Arab leadership. The one that got away was Khaja Amin al-Husseini, who actually was disguised as a woman, got out, okay, and then later on, we can see him later, made his way to the Nazis. It's a real piece of work. But the fact that their political leadership was crippled between 36 and 39 meant that 10 years later, when the national conflict breaks out, the war breaks out between the Jewish and Arab communities of Palestine, the Arabs do not have a significant leadership. We're going to return to this our next session. We talk about the war for independence, but already I'm laying down some of the infrastructure, and we'll return to this idea. The Arabs had lost their leadership. This is a real debacle for them. By the way, also, while this is going on, the Nashashibis and the El Husseinis were killing each other. They were fighting against each other. So we had at least 1,200 people who were kind of killed, Arab on Arab violence. We have this today, by the way. We have this when we get to later on, much more contemporary. We're going to talk about like the second Intifada that happened big time as well, in like Arab on Arab violence, but I'm talking about Palestinian on Palestinian violence. But here you had it as well. Okay, it's very, very important. The Zionist movement, and this was under the agreement of the British, established over 50, basically kibbutzim, which are known as tower and stockade kibbutzim. And by doing so, they were done strategically because they were done along the borders, if you will, He actually created a Zionist presence where it hadn't been before. I'm talking about the presence of communities, and that was very important because it laid down the infrastructure for the UN partition decision in 1947. Okay, where you sit is where you stand, kind of a thing, if you understand what I mean. There are two more results from this revolt, which are very interesting. The first, well, one's tragic and the other one's interesting. We'll start with the interesting one. The British in 1937 are going to propose partition. What's going to happen is they're going to put together something called the Peel Commission. And in the Peel Commission, this is the most thorough investigation the British do about the conflict, and they come to the conclusion that we have two separate national groups that don't see each other, don't want each other, and are vying for the same territory, and they're not going to sit together in peace. And therefore, they, for the first time, the British table, 10 years before the partition plan that the UN is going to vote on in 1947. In 1937, the British come up with their own partition plan, which you can see their original version. They went through several iterations. And the end of the day, they went and nixed it on their own. Okay, I mean, when they kind of offered this partition to the Arabs, they completely said, "No way, Jose." They just said, "No way." I don't think they said, "No way, Jose." They said, "No way." When they turned to the Zionists, they said, "We'll get back to you. You want to think about it." We didn't say yes. We didn't say no. The guy said, "We'll get back to you." The British killed it on their own in 1938 because they realized they didn't want it. In other words, in 1938, the British understood they were heading for a war, and they didn't want to piss the Arabs off. And I don't mean the Arabs in Palestine, the Arabs at large. They understood they were heading for a war. Okay, and therefore they themselves killed this. They totally killed this plan. But the point is, partition was already out there, and that's important to understand. The last thing, and this is what was tragic, was in 1939, the British are going to come up with something called the White Paper Policy, which meant the following. Over the next 5 years, this is from 1939 to 1944, over the next 5 years, we will allow maximum 15,000 Jews to emigrate. You're capping it in 75,000. And we are not allowing more lands to be purchased by the Zionist movement at this point, and we're going to make it very, very difficult to create Jewish communities in the country. Ladies and gentlemen, this was done unwittingly, but this was on the eve of the Holocaust. In other words, this policy of closing the gates of British Mandate Palestine in 1939, unwittingly basically shut down yet one more potential escape route for Jews to flee from what's going to happen in Europe. Of course, the British didn't have a crystal ball and didn't know that. Nobody did. But yet, this is part of the tragedy of that. So, when the Etzel, the Irgun, who was led then by David Raziel, decides to lay down their arms with the outbreak of the war, a small section of them, led by this gentleman, Abraham Stern, said, "No. We're not laying down our arms. Okay? We need to continue fighting the British. This is the only way we're going to get independence." And he created a very extreme military group called Lehi, or the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel. This is a tiny group, had no more than 200 people through most of World War II. And it's such a small group, and such an unpopular group, actually, that most of their activity were assassinations, hits on people. They also had to rob banks, Jewish banks, in order to fund themselves. And they were particularly not popular among the Jewish population. At the end of the day, he's on the run, Abraham Stern. Somebody's going to squeal, and the British are going to assassinate him. He didn't resist arrest, but they killed him while resisting arrest, if you understand what I mean. And he's going to be killed. And it basically shatters this small organization, which will get back on its feet and will be led, let's say, operationally by Yitzhak Shamir, who all of you should know who that was. And I would say that their biggest feat, if you will, in all the years of existence was the assassination of Lord Moyne, who was the highest British diplomat or statesman in the entire Middle East. They sent the two hetmen to Cairo. He was a close personal friend of Churchill's, Lord Moyne. And this hit actually caused the Haganah to go start to hunt down Etzel Lehi and hand him over to the British, because this was something that was considered, it was deemed so unacceptable and so tainted the Zionist movement from the mainstream perspective that they began to hunt down their own people. In any event, I'm taking a step forward. This Lehi organization starts in 1940. Around 1940-41, a little bit afterwards, you have the creation of the Palmach. The Palmach is actually created. Palmach, by the way, literally means shock troops. And it's going to be created together with the British, okay, as elite fighters. And their first actions take place in the Vichy sphere, okay? Collaborationist France, Vichy France, controlled Lebanon and Syria, okay? And when the British actually take over Lebanon, they take by force, the Palmach is going to be participating, and that's when Moshe Dayan loses his eye, gets a bullet, okay, into his eye. That's when he loses his eye. But they're getting combat experience with the British in serious combat. And because of that, the British very, very quickly shut it down. They shut down the Palmach officially, but unofficially, the Palmach continued to exercise and to practice and to train in the different kibbutzim. And they're ultimately going to be the strongest fighting force during the War for Independence in 1948. You're going to have close to 30,000 Jewish men and women from Palestine volunteer for the British Army, and they're going to fight in all of the different corps, CORPS, in the British Army, including, ladies and gentlemen, including the Royal Air Force. So Asa Weizmann was a captain, okay, he was a wing commander in the Royal Air Force, and he becomes one of the most important pilots already in 48. In other words, we're getting operational experience, including in the Royal Engineers, in the Royal Artillery, Pioneers, commandos, communications, logistics, every aspect of a modern army. We're going to get back to this point in our next session because we're going to talk about how Israel managed to build an army rather quickly, and I'm already hinting at it right now. In any event, you had around 30,000 people volunteering. The Jews wanted their own unit, and the British did not want to give it to them because they felt that would be politically not a smart thing to do. But ultimately, the British did create two specifically Jewish units. The first one were the so-called paratroopers, where the British were going to train 100 men and women who came from either occupied countries in Europe or countries that were collaborating with the Nazis, and they knew the language both literally and also culturally of these countries and the terrain. And the concept was to parachute these people behind enemy lines to do two things from a British perspective, to do two things. Number one, to enable British pilots who had been shot out of the air but hadn't been killed to create escape routes to get them out of there. And secondly, to bring intelligence to the British. From their perspective, they were trying to find routes of escape for the Jewish compatriots. Of the 100, about 38 were actually parachuted. Of them, 7 were captured and killed. The most famous of them is the lady off to the left here that I'm sure most of you have heard of, Chana Senesh. Okay, and Chana Senesh is famous for all kinds of reasons that I'm not going to go into right now. Okay, but in any event, this is after this in 1944, 43, 44, the British are going to create a Jewish brigade, which is about 5,000 men, and they will see action in Italy. Now, what is the Palestinian leadership doing while this is happening? Well, our good friend Haji Amin Husseini, who managed to escape from British clutches, okay, dressed like a woman, is going to meet Hitler, and he's going to be very much, very supportive of Hitler's projects to the Jews in Europe. But he remains, as we'd say, kind of a marginal figure. He never actually makes it back and becomes a central figure. But this is what he's up to doing. Okay, and again, you have Jews in the British Navy as well, in the Armored Corps. This is, again, it's very important to understand what the Jews know how to do in 1948. Look, World War II, I don't have to say the word Holocaust more than once right now. I do want to say that the Jews in British Median Palestine were powerless. They had no power. They're living under the British. The most they could do was volunteer for the British Army, which they did in very high numbers. And yet there was a deep sense of guilt, because in 1945, I'll be precise, on the 9th of May, 1945, when World War II is over in Europe, when the European theater is finished, the real information about how many Jews were murdered during the Holocaust comes to light. And when that information comes to light, something like 90% of all the Jews who lived at that moment in British Mandate Palestine had lost relatives, most of them first-degree relatives, meaning their parents, their siblings, their children, and so on and so forth. It was a huge, terrible blow to the Jewish community. The Labour Party that had been in the opposition had been promising throughout the war, if they win the elections, they're going to stop the white paper policy. They're going to allow Jewish immigration and settlement. Lo and behold, Churchill loses the elections in 45, the Labour Party wins, and they do not change the policy. And this is going to engender the creation of a united Jewish revolt, which will combine the Haganah, the Etzel, and the Lechi together. Keeping in mind the Palmach was part of the Haganah. Okay? They're going to combine them together, and they're going to start to coordinate actions against the British. I want to stop here for a second. 1936-39, the British very handily and very easily crushed the Arab revolt. They could just as easily have done the same thing between 1945 and 47, easily. They didn't dare do it after the Holocaust. They didn't dare do it after the Holocaust. If they had gone in with force and put down this Jewish revolt between 45 and 47, like they did in 36 to 39, the Arabs, they would have gone down in history. They couldn't do it. They simply weren't able to do it. Okay, but basically, the combined forces are getting not more radicalized, more and more force, and ultimately we have here something that caused the collapse, pun intended, of this united front. Begin's group, Etzel or the Irgun, in July of 1947, will succeed in infiltrating huge quantities of TNT into the basement of the King David Hotel, the heart of Jerusalem. According to their narrative, they warned the British they had to evacuate. The British had never received these warnings. Be that as it may, the whole southern part of the building, southern wing, collapsed. All of its floors. About 91 people were killed, of course, and as we know, bombs do not discriminate. So, of course, Jews working there were killed, Arabs working there were killed, and Brits were killed. This caused the collapse, basically, of this united front. But this is already running down to a point where the British have come to the conclusion, the realization that this may not be worth it. They're already just about out of India at this point. They've got, at its peak, something like 70,000 troops trying to keep things under wraps here between 45 and 47. Guys, I think at its peak, how many US troops were in Iraq? 150,000? It's 70,000 British troops in a tiny territory, and they couldn't keep a lid on it because the Arabs were revolting as well. Okay, it wasn't worth the while. The British Empire was over, okay, and their economy was a shambles. It had to be basically bailed out by the Marshall Plan, by the United States and the Marshall Plan. They were now the junior, not the senior partner, okay? And even though they participated in the Cold War, it was really between the US and the Soviet Union. The British were sidekicks. And they were beginning to understand it at this point. So basically in 47, they're going to bring over the UN. By the way, the Jews between 45 and 48 managed to build a very sophisticated clandestine network to smuggle Holocaust survivors into the country. They managed to smuggle in something close to 55,000, actually more, 60,000 people in these ships. Some were caught by the British. And when the British began to put their foot down militarily, the Haganah went this route. They decided to go this route. This would be the best way to fight against the British, because and what you see here is the Exodus. And what's very important to understand about the SS Exodus, which takes place in 1947, is that this was an ingenious PR stunt. It was a PR stunt, and the British fell like a ton of bricks. All they needed to do to neutralize this was to let the people in. And instead of that, they went and forcibly removed the people, put them forcibly on 3 different ships, and the ships ended up going back to Germany. And the British looked so heartless at this point. It made them look so bad. They fell right into the trap. This is a trap, okay? It was a brilliant trap, and they fell for it. At the same time this is taking place, the Exodus, you had a special committee on Palestine for the UN called UNSCOP. That's what it says, UN Special Committee on Palestine, okay, who came to investigate what's going on. And what's very interesting is the Zionists met them, took them around, showed them all the things they were doing. The Arabs refused to meet them. refused to talk to them. The British also did not cooperate with them. So the side that was heard was the Zionist side. They saw, on the one hand, they saw the brutality of the British with Exodus. On the other hand, they saw some Jewish terror attacks. And at the end of the day, they came back and they made a recommendation for partition, which will then be voted upon, okay, on the 29th of November, 1947, in Resolution 181 in the General Assembly. And at this point, I have way over my 45 minutes. I'm now an hour and 15 minutes into this. So I apologize if I had too much ground to cover. I think every session I'm going to apologize. I'm trying to make this 45 minutes in questions, but I'm not succeeding in the meantime. What I will do right now is I'm going to check out your questions that came to me via chat. Has the Grand Mufti involved in the story? I think I explained that already. I don't understand this question about legally, they were still under the British mandate 28 to 29. Of course, the British mandate is going to last from 22 to 48. The rioting and the attacks took place in 28 to 29, as I mentioned previously, take place in an atmosphere where the British they'd been so much quiet for almost a decade. The British they loosened their hands on the tiller. They basically had downsized their manpower dramatically, and they were incapable of actually dealing with the rioting that took place in 29. They, by the way, set up a Blue Ribbon Commission of Inquiry regarding who owns the Western Wall, and they published it in 1930, claiming that because these are retaining walls of the Muslim side above, that they belong to the Muslims, but the status quo of enabling Jews to pray there shouldn't be changed. Okay, just so you know. Okay, so getting back to, I'm being asked a question here about the religious conflict. I said there really is no inherent reason for religious conflict. The reason I said that again is because the Zionist movement was a secular one. It wasn't premised on religious ideas. It wasn't messianic. It wasn't interested in religious sites. This was not its main. In fact, was even less interested in Jerusalem per se. Of course, there's a Muslim component, but keep in mind you had also Arab Christians, okay, and you had Arabs who were secular. It becomes a rallying point. Jerusalem, and specifically the Temple Mount, becomes a rallying point for the Muslims, and it was done deliberately by Haji Amin Husseini in order to, get his stock up. Okay, it says here all conflict around the world involves Muslims. Absolutely not. There are plenty of conflicts around the world that do not involve Muslims. I'll give you just a few tastes of conflicts that do not involve Muslims. I'm thinking World War II and World War I, but putting those two aside, the troubles in Ireland don't involve Muslims. The Croatians and the Serbs were two different Christian denominations going at each other's throats. I can give you a whole slew of conflicts. The next conflict, unfortunately, which is going to be a really bad between China and Taiwan, doesn't involve Muslims. It's no. Okay. Do I think a one-state solution is a viable plan? That is a question for our last session. Not right now. Okay. Yeah, the comment here that Begin's photo looks a bit too old. Looks like he's old. That's correct. I have to use photos that I have no copyright issues with. Okay. Was the reason the British sided with the Arabs because of their need for oil? Okay, that's a very good question. Well, yes and no. For sure, when we get down to the late 1930s, there's definitely a need for the Arab oil, okay? But one has to take into account that if you disengage, you try to be dispassionate about this thing, okay? And you try to disengage from what you think about the whole conflict and just look at it in this way, it made more sense for the British to put their bets on the Arab horse. I mean, there were a lot more Arab states. The Jews were a really small group there. And just looking at the numbers, it appeared that there was a bit more, I'm talking about pre-Holocaust. There was a lot more, let's say, legitimacy, if you're looking at it dispassionately, from the Arab side there. So it doesn't have to just be about the oil. If you're doing realpolitik and you're looking at the different states around there, you want the Arab states on your side, especially when World War II was rolling around, and also after the war was over. They tried very hard to stay in good relations with the Arab states. By the way, de Gaulle jettisoned the excellent relations that France had with Israel. We're going to talk about that in a different session. Okay, the great relationship to Israel and France that developed, and a lot of military cooperation in the 50s, early 60s. De Gaulle jettisoned it because he wanted to get close to North African Arab states. Okay, and it wasn't about their oil; it had nothing to do with oil there. So there are other reasons. It's not, but oil certainly is going to start to take more of a central role. Prior to the partition proposal, what was the British vision for the future of the British mandate? That's a very, very good question. And we don't have a good answer, because on the one hand, we could maybe cynically say the British had no intention when they entered the mandate of ever giving up the area. I mean, they were an empire. This whole mandate thing was foisted on them by Wilson's principles, right? His points and so on and so forth. That might be the case. On the other hand, at some point they understood that they're not going to be there forever. It's simply not important enough for them. And they're looking for a kind of an exit strategy. They were constantly trying at the very beginning to create some kind of joint representative body of Jews and Arabs, what they called the Legislative Council. The Jews were up for it, the Arabs were not. And it just didn't fly. They couldn't really get it going. And look, again, we have to keep in mind that Palestine was a geographically peripheral area, far from, and it wasn't the most important British interest. India is so much more important. There's so many other places that are so much more important, okay, than Palestine for the British. So we have to keep that in mind as well. But look, they gave up India. They gave up a lot of places. They gave up Ireland. And they gave up a lot of places that they thought they would never give up. So it's very, very hard. And we don't know. It's not clear, what their end game was. Okay. If they thought there were going to be two states there, what was going to happen? What is clear is that their partition plan of 1937 would have that Arab state in some kind of confederation with Jordan. That is important. Were the Arab Christians numerous in Palestine? And did they fight the Muslims or only the Jews? Okay, so I'll make it very, very brief. The Arab Christians were a minority, but they were a more significant minority then than they are today. No, there were a lot more then than they are today, but they were a minority. That's number one. Number two, the Arab Christians found themselves in a very, very awkward position till today. I don't mean in Israel, I mean till today, because once the national movement becomes more Islamic or takes on that kind of feel, and that's true of everywhere in the Middle East, okay, they're not Muslims. And sometimes they had to prove, their bones, or prove that they're authentic as nationalists by being even more radical. That's why like George Khabash was Christian, one of the worst terrorists in the PLO. Okay, but they had to prove their bones. They had to show how they're not Muslims, but they're totally on board. So for sure, you had Arab Christians that were part of the Palestinian national movement. None of the major leaders were Christian. Okay, but you did. I'm talking back then. But you had some significant players, and of course they participated in fighting against the Jews during the war. What was the U.S. position during this time? The U.S. was not during this time. This time is the problem of this question, because the British were changing their policy, conditioned. First of all, the Americans were changing their policy based on what America was. America at the end of World War I was not America at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, we begin the American century. At the end of World War I, America emerges as a power, but it's not entirely clear to the entire world just how powerful America is. Okay, right after World War I. After World War II, it becomes entirely clear to the world that's an American century, except for the Soviets, obviously. But you get my point. So the American position initially in 1919 was actually opposed to the Balfour Declaration. Okay, just so we make that clear. They sent a commission to check things out, and they came to the conclusion that this was not going. The Arabs were the majority, and this was not good for them. having said all this, the United States was not so engaged with this story until after World War II. The United States per se becomes very engaged after World War II because a lot of Zionist activity takes place from the United States, and the U.S. under Truman tries to pressure the British to allow Holocaust survivors to enter mandate Palestine after the war, and the British refuse to do it. This becomes a major bone of contention between Truman and the Brits, and so the United States is much more pro-Zionist at that point. Let's put it that way. What about British anti-Semitism? What about it? I'm not sure. What role did British anti-Semitism play in the interwar years? Okay, look. I'm going to answer this question in a very, very different way. With your permission. The Zionist view of the British Mandate period typically was that the British made these big promises in 1917, and initially in 1919, 1920, 21, were holding to their promise and spent the rest of the mandate little by little retreating from their promises, and were a big disappointment. The Arab-Palestinian narrative is that the British were supporting the Zionists the whole time. Today, most Israeli Zionist historians, will accept the fact that the British did not interfere with the Zionist movement from creating an embryonic Jewish state, of building state institutions in those 30 years, which enabled the Zionist movement in 1948 to emerge as a modern democracy and a stable one. That was done under the British. It wasn't Shangri-La, it wasn't the Garden of Eden, and there's a lot of criticism, but they didn't get in the way too much, okay, of the Zionists. They let the Zionists have their own educational system, create a health system, okay. The Haganah, the British turned a blind eye to. I mean, it was underground, but it really wasn't underground. The British knew all about the Haganah, okay, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, the British kind of enabled this. When we meet in our next session, another month, and we deal with the war for independence, we're going to raise the question about what the British role was during the first half of the war when the British were present. And I think you're going to be surprised to see what happens, okay? It's not as cut and dry as you may think, okay? I don't think that anti-Semitism played a dramatic role in British policy because the policy was done at the top. Churchill was actually pro-Zionist before he became prime minister, okay? And he wasn't anti-Zionist, okay? You have to keep in mind the British have their own interests, and their own interests may not jibe with the Zionist movement's interests, and they're always going to follow their own interests. It's going to have to be very, very clear. To be sure, a lot of the British who were serving in British Mandate Palestine were not enamored of the Jews there, because they were used to looking down on the native people and expecting them to look up at them. And the Jews didn't look up to the British people. They looked them straight in the eye as equals, with kind of like an attitude. You know, we wrote the Bible that you like to read. Okay, so you know, and the British didn't like that. We weren't proper wogs, if I can use a terrible word that the British called natives in different places. And by the way, the Indians also didn't look up to the British. The British only thought they did. That's what the Indians in India. They only thought they did. They didn't really look up to them. That was the British attitude. The same thing. They thought the Arabs looked up to them. They didn't really look up to them. Okay, but the Jews couldn't play the game. The Jews looked them straight in the eye at eye level, and it really pissed them off. And you know, Jews could also be arrogant. Let's be honest. Okay, without me I'm Jewish. Without waxing anti-Semitic, Jews can be a bit arrogant as well. So the British didn't like that. They weren't the right kind of natives for the British. No, it weren't the right kind of. Not didn't mean that all the British that served didn't like all the Jews there. We talk about the next session. We're going to find that there were some Brits who actually sided with the Jews, literally and figuratively, okay, with their bodies, and some sided with the Arabs as well. It's a mixed bag. It's very much a mixed bag. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Last question, guys. What ultimately was the impact of the attack at the King David Hotel? The impact of the attack in the hotel was basically the collapse of the United Jewish Revolt. It didn't cause the British to leave. The British left because they came to a conclusion that they were overextended, that their economy was shattered. By the way, just by I don't know if you realize this, 1944, the Nazis were kicked out of Greece, and you started the civil war there between the communists and the nationalists, and the British were trying to help the nationalists put down the communists, and they couldn't do it. They didn't have the manpower, and they asked the United States to pull their fat out of the fire. The British were totally overextended. They were totally overextended in 47. They had to get their troops out of the country. It simply wasn't important enough for the British at the end of the day. Okay, I think it would not be correct to say that the Jews chased them out. That's a nice Zionist fantasy. It's not the reality. The King David Hotel didn't impact the British leaving there. Were those who implicated subsequently shunned? Not really. It didn't remain a bone of contention. But of course, you have to understand the Jews who were killed by the bombing of the King David Hotel. We're not big fans of Menachem Begin and his group, ever. How could they be if their dad was killed, or their brother was killed, or their father was killed, or their sister was killed, or their mom was killed, or their grandma was killed? Because it was basically the civilian headquarters of the British, and you had Jews working there, and they weren't collaborators. It was their job, a secretary or something. They weren't collaborators. They weren't considered collaborators. It was their job. They're working for the government. Okay, very prosaic, and they found their death there. And you can imagine there were people who were not happy about it. Folks, thank you for bearing with me. This was way too long, and I apologize. Once again, I will try and probably fail to make this shorter in our next meeting. I really will try, and I will, before next meeting, supply you with more reading material and bibliography for this session. Stay healthy, everybody.
Fantastic, and I will formally close us out for today. Thank you, Avi, for today's lecture. Thank you all for your questions. As a reminder, Avi will provide resources for each part of these series. I just dropped the link to a Wakelet that houses those resources. We will also send them out with our recording and our evaluation email. Avi will continue this series on November 21st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll focus in on the war for independence. Avi will also be here twice this coming week, both Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesday's session will focus in on our monthly Israel update, and Thursday is our post-film discussion this month featuring the film The Road to Babi Yar. Also on Wednesday, we have the first installment in our series on the complexity of Holocaust scholarship with Dr. Michael Berenbaum. This session will feature a discussion on women in the Holocaust with Dr. Carol Rittner. To sign up for these programs and more, please visit our event page on our website, classroomswithoutborders.org/event. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.